part of the Gaelic world, but more recently, the communities were pushed to the coast because of land clearances and invasion. So they say that in a community by the coast, there was a man who was wandering down by the bluffs one day and he heard a strange sound. And it was the sound of singing, and it was the sound of women singing. And he got down low to the ground, but he tried to peer down at the beach. He was quite high up. But he thought that if it was what he thought, then he better figure it out and he better get down there. So he scrambled his way down to the beach. He took a long way so that he wouldn't scare them off. When he got down on the beach, he crept up to a rock where he might be able to see them a little clearer. And all he could see was splashing in the water and flashing shapes and the sound of this beautiful singing. And he got on top of this rock and he peered and he saw, just beyond the next rock, he saw 3 women swimming. But swimming so gracefully, swimming so beautifully, that there was no chance they could be human. So he crept a little closer, and sure enough, right beside the next rock, he saw their skins, seal skins, and they were in a pile. And he'd heard the stories, and he knew that these Selkies, these women, should they put on their skin again, they'd return to the ocean and they wouldn't come out again for who knows how long. Could be months, could be years. He might never see one again in his life. Most people never do. They hear their songs sometimes, and sure, there's those ones who know how to pull them and help them with the fishing. But rare that someone gets to see them, and rare that someone gets to see them without them noticing. So he watched them for a while, but he crept close enough to get one of those skins, get his hand on it, and he sat on it. And soon enough, those women, those sisters, they came for their skins. And 2 of them came up and they said, "Give us our sister's skin." And he said, "I won't." And they said, "Give us our sister's skin." He said, "I won't." And they looked back at their sister and she said, "He won't give it." And the other 2 grabbed their skins, threw them over their shoulders, and in an instant they were seals, diving and leaping back into the ocean and swimming away. And when they got a short ways out, their heads popped up and they looked back with those big eyes, full of longing. And their sister stood on the shore in her human form and just raised a hand. And she knew that was her fate. She knew that, try as she might, she wouldn't change it. And so she did come ashore with that man. And she did marry that man, and she did learn to love that man. That man said to her, "Just give me 7 years." Because truly he was in love. Love can strike someone that way. And he said, 7 years, give me 7 years. Because of course she said, "I will return to my people. I will return to my home." And he said, "Give me 7 years." And so resigned to her fate, she lived a good life. She married. They were well regarded in the community. They had children, 1 and then 2 and then 3. All with the darkest hair. And they say that there were times when she would go about searching for a skin and she had no idea where her husband had hidden it. That she could never find it. But she knew that he would keep it. She knew that he wouldn't destroy it. She knew it must be somewhere, and she would search for it. And they say that there was a sadness about her. She was a woman with much aliveness and much to give. They say she made the finest seaweed soup you could find in those parts. And her husband became a fantastically successful fisherman. They never wanted for fish. And they were well loved and well regarded. But she would often sit on the beach staring out at the horizon. And her children sometimes would come and sit with her, and they knew by now they wouldn't talk to her, they'd just sit and watch the waves, sit and look out. And there was a day when her youngest, her 4th, a daughter, when she was sitting at the beach alone one day, came running down to her and she said, "Mommy, Mommy, can you tell us what it is? Can you tell us what we found? We found a cloak that's as soft as the sea foam. It's as light as sea mist. What can it be?" And her mother looked at her and said, "Show me, child." And her daughter took her up to the barn and showed her stuffed in one of the eaves of the roof into the thatch. She pulled out her own skin and she shook it off, and it was just as soft and just as light and just as shiny as ever. And she held it and she looked at her daughter. And she bent down to her and she said, "I must go." And she went down to the beach. And by then the rest of her children were there. And she put her sealskin on, and I couldn't tell you what she said to them, but I'm sure she said something. But she put her skin on, and she went into the water, and she swam out. And just before she would go beyond the reach of their view, her little head popped up and stared at them with those big eyes. And then she turned and died and took off. And they say that there's certain families who carry that story and who tell of one of their matriarchs as this seal, or some other seal, or some other place. And of course, this is the same story in a different form. This is the same story of what we can so deeply love and yet not possess. Some critical part of ourselves, some wild part of ourselves, but also what we rely on the land. The deer certainly used to be the staple food for the Gaelic people. And fish, of course. But there's something about mammals that we can inherently relate to and fall in love with, perhaps a little easier than fish. And the seal became a very, very critical staple resource for the coastal people, particularly in its hide. And up until recently, it was custom amongst coastal Gaelic communities for certainly men who would do the seal hunting to wear a sealskin vest. And their blubber was used and their meat was used, but their hide was very, very much relied on, in the same way that the Inuit rely on the seal. And there's huge grief in that story, in both stories. And this seems to be a thread in the tradition as well, in songs today, and songs that keep getting sung, and stories that keep getting told about the depths of what can be loved, and then the pain of how it is lost at some point. And of course, through the history of the Gaelic people, it was the English who were dehumanizing them, occupying their lands, forcing them off, calling them savages. These were the people who were retaining an intact sense of land-based culture and spirituality in those regions after the English, long before the Celtic English, had been completely disrupted by the Romans, and after them the Angles and the Saxons. And by this point, say if we go back 300-400 years, perhaps when this story started to become more and more important, this was around the time when English lords were being given the lands in the Highlands of Scotland, all over Scotland and in Ireland. And a lot of the communities, we know that a lot of them had to leave during that period, but also a lot of them got forced to live on the coast. That was the only land they could have. And in the sandy soil there, the macha, they call it in Scotland, all they could cultivate was potatoes and kale, maybe some oats. And the only economy they had was the fishing. By that point, the fishery was suffering already. But also it was collecting kelp and burning kelp, incredibly labor-intensive work, and they would use the potash, they would sell it to the copper smelting industry. So there's very sour memories of that time when a lot of people were leaving and a lot of people were suffering. But what comes from that time is this story where the seals, who gave the people their clothing, gave them important meat and blubber, became truly the beloved of the people. So the grief is in there right from the beginning. And I would say that colonized peoples, which is sort of old people at this point, if they can remain connected to their grief practices and to the deep thread of grief running through their history, but also right back to this origin of our presence here as humans and as animals, then there can be new life that comes from it. There can be possibility that comes from all the